Hello everyone, welcome to the third analytic HP debate. Today's motion will be on liberal democracy versus populism. Arguing for liberal democracy will be Archie, arguing for populism will be Luke, and I'll be the chair. So, could Archie please make his opening statement?
Yes. My opening statement is going to be based upon one principle, and that is that politics is about shaping the future and it's about trying to build a future. And the problem with populism, despite all of its other errors and quirks, is that it offers no substantial changes for the future and is therefore not worthy of politics. Populism is built off hatred of some factor of the present, whether that be the fact that there's unemployment rising, or the fact that people feel that their culture is being taken away from them, or whether that people feel like they've been mistreated by an elite, or whether people feel like they're not being represented by their government. It is a hatred of something which a few people use to build power off. And that is why populism is not worthy of being present in any country, and especially now when we have a populist president of the United States. We have populist leaders and populist politicians coming out all over Europe, Asia, Africa, every continent. And these populist leaders are doing nothing other than divide every country that they are present in. They are creating thems everywhere, whether that be the elite, of which they are often part of themselves, whether that be people from a certain country, religion, ethnicity, people who are from anywhere outside the country, people who are even within the country, immigrants who have come to the country, whether, it can be any them within any country. And having populist leaders will damage everything that the world has spent every year since the end of the Second World War, bar the last 5 years, trying to build up. In the Bretton Woods Agreement, the United Nations was created, the International Monetary Fund was created, and the World Bank was created, along with many other international globalist organizations. These have helped developing countries to rise. They have helped the world economy to grow. They've helped to lower unemployment. They've helped to make people's lives better. And populist and politicians are coming along and feeding off everything, every little thing that has gone wrong with liberal democratic regimes and parties that have been in power in the last in the last 70 years or more in some countries. I'd just like to talk about the last time populist leaders fed off hatred to gain power, and that is in Europe in the 1920s. And that resulted in a war. And while I'm not calling populists fascists, I'm talking about the divisions that they created in the world, and those divisions are not worth us creating again, because some people want power and some people want to feed off things that have gone wrong in liberal democratic parties and liberal democratic governments around the world. Those are my main points, and that is my opening statement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Archie. Luke, could you please make your opening statement and maybe touch on a few of the things that Archie has said in his statement?
Sure. Now, first of all, I think Archie fails to address some of the hard facts of populist leaders. When Donald Trump got into office, the economy was a wreck, right? Since the 2008 financial crisis in the United States, the economy had been a wreck and it had been downtrodden. Trump single-handedly, with the help of the Federal Reserve and low interest rates, the economy was booming until this coronavirus crisis, but that obviously is an act of God and out of anybody else's control. And I think Archie says that populism is built on the hatred of something. Now, I think you're fundamentally wrong in saying that. Populism isn't built on hatred of anything. Populism is built on a sense of nationality and a sense of unity. And I think that is what globalism doesn't provide for the nation state. Populism isn't built on hatred. Populism is built on the belief that the nation state is supreme, on the belief that the nation state is what, on the belief of the benefit of the nation state. Now you see that in the Brexit movement, and you see that in the Trump movement. You see that in sort of these globalist sort of world bureaucracies that have tried to impose globalism on countries, which is often bad for the little man, often bad for the people who actually work to provide the country. It's all well and good for lofty bureaucrats to declare globalism and to be supreme over the world, and that the little man and his petty concerns shouldn't matter. But I think populism has provided a voice for these people who've too often been downtrodden, the people whose jobs were exported to China, which, by the way, the whole world community until this point was allowing them to use predator borrowing in the Belt and Road Initiative, which you can look at our other debate if you want to see. But back on track, I think that if we sort of liberal democracy has served us well, and this debate is framed wrong. Populism exists within the frame of liberal democracy, and we shouldn't be arguing against populism versus liberal democracy. We should be arguing populism versus globalism. And globalism is what's hurting people. And the reason that unemployment is at an all-time high in the US is because Trump has taken a stand against the globalists. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to defend Trump as a president. I'm going to defend Trump for his policies. And arguably, they're not his policies. Arguably, they're policies of the Republican Party. Nevertheless, because of the Republican Party, which is now no longer the top hat Republican Party, no longer the party of the elite. Since the Tea Party movement, the Republican Party has turned into the party of the little guy. And what you see is unemployment numbers rising. You see the economy is booming up until this coronavirus crisis. But like I said before, that is beyond anyone's control. And the Democratic Party and left-leaning parties all over the world have failed to connect with working class voters. And that is the key message. The fact that the Labour Party in the UK, the Democratic Party in the US, all of the left-leaning parties in the world, there's not a single I believe the figure is there's not a single left-leaning party in power in Europe or North America. And that is because the left-leaning parties' demographics has become smaller and smaller and smaller, because they're no longer appealing to working class people, because they've no longer been the party of the working class. They are now the party of the hip middle class who are less concerned with economic issues and more concerned with these sort of woke social issues, which, to be frank, no one is concerned about apart from them. And I think that is the key point here. That is the key point. The point is that populism connects with people, connects with the little people on a level that any other ideology doesn't, and provides them a voice. And I think within the frame of liberal democracy, populism is beneficial. And I don't think that I will go so far as to defend every populist politician. For example, and oftentimes their characters aren't as good as we'd like to think. But I think that's the same with every sort of politician. And I think the crude sort of populism of Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, I think that populism from a personality point of view isn't ideal. Well, it's far from ideal, but the ideology and the policies is what I'm trying to argue about. And I think the policies of populism has been serving the world well since they've started to gain traction. And populism, it isn't unpopular, as the name suggests, right? And that's why the movement has taken the world by storm. We've got Brexit in the UK, Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Le Pen in France, Orban in Hungary. All of these people have taken the world by storm, and no one has anticipated it. And that's because the people who are anticipating it are the out-of-touch elite. They don't feel the changing tides of society. And that is what matters. That is why populism is beneficial. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your opening statement, Luke. Archie, would you like to reply to some of the things that Luke has said in his opening statement?
Yes, please. So Luke's points were essentially built upon the fact that liberal democracy has apparently failed to help the people. And I'd just like to say one simple thing in reply to that, and that is the failures of one good ideology is not a reason to switch to an evil one. The populism does nothing other than divide society. It's not built upon unity, as Luke has said to us. Populism is built on dividing people. Populism is built on uniting small groups of people, small groups of voters. Populism is built upon trying to get votes, not upon trying to make the country better. And politics should be upon building a new future. Populism should be upon building a better future. And populism offers no substantial future, which is why it should not be in power. Luke also touched upon the fact that the economy grew under Trump, and that's just simply, while the economy did grow under Trump, it literally grew at the exact same rate that it grew at under Obama, and that is undeniable, and that cannot be. And even if it did grow more, then which there are arguments to and for, no one can guarantee either way, because numbers depend on different factors. Even if it is true, then it was not about Trump. It was about the global community's economy rising. It was about corporations becoming bigger. Trump was not involved in that, and that is shown by the fact that employment is not rising in the United States. The United States has an incorrect way of measuring unemployment, which means that millions of unemployed people potentially can be thought of as employed based upon tiny incomes that mean that they are just as unemployed as anyone who is living in the street. I'd also like to touch on the sheer incompetence of populist leaders around the world. Luke touched upon the leaders of the United States and of Brazil, and those two countries have the highest COVID death rates in the world. The US federal government took no action against the coronavirus. It was all done on a state level, and this should not be the case that that governments are letting their populations die at the rate that they are. And that is just proof that populists care about themselves, not the people, because it is the small man, as Luke was addressing it, that is being worst affected by the coronavirus. And if populists really care about the small man, the US and Brazil would have been in lockdown much earlier. And in the case of Brazil, would be in a much better lockdown, and in the case of some US states as well. Luke also spoke about the fact that globalism is apparently hurting people. What has happened under globalism is what has been happening for years, and that is the gap between rich and poor has gotten bigger. However, so many hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of absolute poverty by globalism, and it hasn't met the goals that we'd like it to have met, and that is often the case with political ideologies. But But as I've already said, the failures and the quirks of one ideology, which is overall good, is not the reason to switch to one which is built upon hatred, division, and most importantly, built upon making a few people powerful on the backs of the working class, which they claim to be protecting. Thank you.
Luke, do you agree with what Archie is saying here?
First of all, obviously Archie didn't hear what I was saying when I talked about how this debate was framed wrong. I am not in favor of the complete scrapping of liberal democracy. In fact, I'm completely in favor of liberal democracy. And I'm arguing against globalism, not liberal democracy. Populism exists within the frame of liberal democracy. I think that is key. But it's not populism that's undemocratic. It's the bureaucracy created by globalism. For example, a trademark example would be the UK and the EU. The EU is a body that, for the most part, is undemocratic because of the great bureaucracy it creates. And although MEPs are elected, first of all of Europe can override the UK on a singular issue. And that's the point. That's undemocratic. The globalist bureaucracy that's being created. And in the US, another example of this great bureaucracy is the whole FISA thing. Now, the argument that Trump colluded with Russia has been given a lot of airtime in the news. What hasn't been given the airtime is the great corrupt mismanagement happening by the FBI at the highest levels, using the FISA using the FISA system. And I think that is something that no one has addressed, even though it's also a great bureaucratic mismanagement. And that's the point. The bureaucracy of globalism hasn't served the little man. The trade deals set up with China, while they blatantly steal Western intellectual property and steal jobs there, it's disgusting. And while bureaucrats have done nothing about it, because the point is they benefit from it. And may I add, you talked about coronavirus cases. First of all, China doesn't have very good data. They lie about their data. And the US is the third most populous country in the world. And Brazil is up there as well. I think Brazil is fourth. So is it sort of illogical that they would have the most coronavirus cases? And India is rising as well, because they are the second largest country in the world. And the UK at the moment is third. And they're not under a populist leader. They're under Boris Johnson. And so maybe maybe the actual UK number is disproportionate to their population, while the US number is more proportionate because they have the first largest cases in the world and have one of the largest populations and area in the world. So that, and although, yes, this could be managed better by any government, with the notable exception of the South Koreans, the Dutch, the Swedish, and the Taiwanese. But most countries have managed the coronavirus badly, and Trump could have done it better. I agree. So could every other prime minister, president, and monarch. Also, Archie talked about how populism divides people. And I think this is a typical card played by the elitist globalist elite. And this, it hasn't fooled people voting for populist leaders. The idea that populism is somehow racist and dividing it's completely untrue. There is a difference between standing up for immigration security, standing up for law and order, standing up for sovereignty, than being racist. And it's been somehow misconstrued by the elite, or intentionally misconstrued by the globalist elite, that populists are somehow racist by simply proposing law and order and cultural assimilation and things like that. Because what we don't want to happen is we don't want culture to diminish. We don't want the nation state to be watered down. And I think that's the key point. It's not a disdain, it's not a racism, it's not a divisiveness. Rather, it's more of a support for culture, tradition, and institution. And I don't think I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's also intellectually lazy to simply claim anything that you disagree with as being racist. And I think that's oftentimes what the left has done. And to be honest, that sort of woke ideology hasn't fooled a lot of people. And so rather than simply shutting down our opponents and claiming them to be racist or divisive or whatnot, we should have a debate about policy prescriptions, rather than simply racism or sexism or any other isms. So with that, I'll hand over to Archie again.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to touch on racism so much because it will bring us into dangerous territory, potentially in what we might say. Of course, we're at quite a sensitive time at the moment. So I'm just going to start with Luke's first point, which is when he said that he's debating against globalism rather than liberal democracy, and the globalism has let the people down, and that populism is not going to let the people down. And I'm going to start by saying populism is going to let the people down, because populism doesn't give a substantial future. Populism isn't giving people a future. Populism isn't offering an alternative future. Populism is saying we're going to get rid of this, we're going to get rid of that. Populism is not saying we're going to create a world in which this is happening, because they're not going to create a world, they're just going to damage the one we're living in right now. Also, globalism. Globalism has failed in some aspects, and I'm going to stand up here and I'm going to say that right now. And I don't think there's a single globalist in the world who can say that globalism has never failed. However, what globalism has done is it has improved the world. It has improved people's lives, as I said earlier. It has improved the economies of so many countries who really needed that. And it has helped us move away from the world that we were left with after the Second World War. It has helped people, so many people, move out of countless generations of xenophobic people, while we still have so much a way to go on that, no doubt, but it has definitely helped. And I also, Luke is talking about the FBI being corrupt and investigating Trump. And look, politicians should not get involved in the justice system. Politicians should not be sacking those involved in the justice system, like Donald Trump did, at the exact same time that there's an investigation going into them. Because if they have done nothing illegal, they shouldn't be worried. And if they have done something illegal, then they shouldn't be a leader. And Trump is a typical example of a populist leader who has done something illegal. And frankly, even populists like Steve Bannon have said that Trump's meetings with Russian, I can't remember what their relationship with, but was with the Russian government, was borderline treason in Trump Tower. You know, he wasn't in the White House. There was no state involvement in this. It was the president meeting with Russian entities and Russian people, potentially doing harm to his own country. And even populists say that that is borderline treason. And I don't want this to turn into a debate about whether or not Trump is good, but I do want to say that politicians should not be involved in the justice system, and that politicians should not be breaking the law. Thirdly, or fourth, the press is I just want to bring up very quickly. Too often nowadays is our media outlets being endorsed by politicians. It is restricting freedom of speech. We are constantly moving towards a more and more illiberal world, and that is one of the things that I'm arguing for now. A liberal world in which the press does not lie, the press is not endorsed by politicians, the press does not the press does not promote damaging ideas. The press is an entity which allows people access to opinions of all kinds, but not ones that will destroy society that we live in. And while some may say that that's not possible in practice, and of course it's not possible, but I'm talking about a world that we want to be moving towards. And if we're constantly moving towards a world in which we have aims, a world in which we aim for, people there to be no poverty in the world, you can set you can set countless goals, and that will mean that we're moving forward. It would mean, and also most importantly, it will mean that we are moving together as a country and as one planet. And that's important, because if we leave people behind, then, as we know, it creates conflicts, and it creates dangerous and it gives dangerous people a chance to come into power. And that happened in the extremes in the 1920s and 30s, and it's happening in the lesser extremes nowadays with people like Trump. But even his response to the riots has been arguably fascistic, and that should definitely be looked into, and things like that. And it is going to become a figurehead, and it is a display of the violence which comes and the conflicts which arise when politicians divide a country, and when politicians endorse people who say terrible things. And I'd then like to move on to just very quickly about when Luke said, shouldn't it be normal for the US and Brazil to have high COVID rates because they have high populations? I think I phrased my comment incorrectly, and that is that on a state level, the response to the pandemic was completely incompetent. And of course, this country, the United Kingdom, there were problems, and we arguably did a terrible job. But the point that I'm trying to raise is that the populist politicians are not offering solutions even to something as simple as the coronavirus pandemic, where in the US and Donald Trump left it to the states to deal with. They don't even offer a substantial future option when coping with something like a virus. Lastly, I'd like to talk about when Luke said we don't want culture to diminish, because I think that's an important point. Culture is, of course, important, and culture will survive so long as people are involved in it and practice it. And people from different countries moving around, and I'm not talking about freedom of movement between all kinds of countries, because that's very difficult to maintain. It will be very damaging. But people being able to migrate between countries, and it being possible for people to be able to kind of easily migrate between countries, is good for them, not bad for them, because it will enrich culture, because it will bring new entities which we like. And culture moves forwards with the time, because culture is about how the people behave, and culture is about the behavior that people like. And if people endorse a behavior, then it means that that becomes part of the culture. Therefore, culture cannot diminish. Also, even if culture did diminish, then the populist ideals of things like America First and their basically protectionist and isolationist policies are just not good enough, because there are so many billions of people in the world who need help, who need to come out of the situation that they're in. And if they do, it will help the world move forwards. It will help both, the elite. It will help the middle class. It will help the lower class. It will help the people who I'm talking about, who are currently in poverty. And if to bring the world and if to bring so many billions of people out of this disgraceful state of life that they're living in will cause things like sort of the culture of waving the United States flag all the time to diminish a little, then frankly, so be it. Because if populist politicians are arguing that that something like a tradition such as waving flags and going to church is more important than saving lives, then that alone is enough for an ideology to be dismissed as not good enough. Thank you.
Okay, Luke, what response do you have to that?
Archie said something as simple as the coronavirus pandemic in his statement. Now, is the coronavirus pandemic simple, or has anyone handled it right? I don't think that was maybe a right thing to say. Second of all, Archie talked about the press, and he said that the press shouldn't be endorsing or endorsed by politicians and should be impartial. I'm sorry. Do you think that the press in the present day is impartial or is not impartial towards the left or towards the right? I think the press is overwhelmingly anti-populist, overwhelmingly anti-Trump, overwhelmingly anti any other ideology apart from this sort of present globalist ideology. And statements have come out saying that, and that's because press is owned by these giant conglomerates, and the only right-wing press conglomerate is News Corporation, owned by Robert Murdoch, and that's why you have the notable exceptions of Fox News, maybe in London, the Times and the Daily Mail. But regardless of that, generally the press is overwhelmingly left-wing. So I agree. I want an impartial press, and in that sense, I don't think we should have a sort of left-wing press. Archie also talked about that the FBI shouldn't be political. And I completely agree as well. That's why the whole FISA investigation and the biased FBI against Trump was completely disgusting. Now, I'm not going to go on Team Trump because I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm far from a Trump supporter. In this present election, I would vote for Biden because I think Trump has been quite a divisive president. But what I would like to say, and although it's a nuanced difference, I think it's a difference that a lot of people will understand. I support populism. I don't support Trumpian populism. And I support some of Trump's policies that he's implemented. But I don't think that Trump is smart enough to think up any of those policies. Original Trump policies would be something as stupid as a border wall. Original Trump policies are the injecting alcohol into yourself so you get cured from coronavirus. And I'm not in favor of policies such as those. But some of the policies that I think weren't actual Trump policies were implemented by some of his advisors were the tariffs against China that have brought jobs back to the US, a lot of his foreign policy, and the like. And I think those are sort of trademark populist policies, which aren't actually Trumpian. And I think that we ought to differentiate those. It's a nuance different, but I think it's a very important one. So I'm not defending Trump here. I'm defending populist policies. And I think that when Archie talks about how globalism has helped people and how culture is diminishing, I think this is the sort of elitism that populism is exactly trying to combat. The idea that the nation state isn't in control of itself. I believe in immigration. I think every single person believes in immigration. As an American, it would be hypocritical to not believe in immigration, because every single American citizen is descended from an immigrant, apart, of course, from the Indians, the American Indians. Now, we should differentiate immigration that is beneficial to the country, that entails cultural assimilation, that entails the good jobs being filled, with the sort of immigration that leads to sort of ghettos and leads to sort of the taking away of jobs and things like that, and leads to a government not being able to control its own borders. I think that's the sort of immigration, the illegal immigration that the Trumpian movement and the Brexit movement in the UK were combating. The idea that we should be able to be in control of our own borders and we should have a legal system for people to get in. I think that's important because I don't understand why Archie sort of put the poverty juxtaposed with culture, because they're completely different. I think populist policies so far have been very, very helpful, especially in the US and the UK, where the economy is booming and unemployment is at an all-time low, apart from, like I've said, the coronavirus pandemic, which has caused things to get interrupted, obviously. But I think that culture is an important part, and the nation state is an important part of life. And Archie's clear sort of disdain for that is exactly what caused populism to be populism to gain so much traction. Because I think in reality, regular working class people are in favor of the nation state, in favor of traditional culture and values, and that's what populism is bringing back. And that's what the belief in the nation state, the belief in democracy, the belief against bureaucracy, all of those are key hallmarks of populism. And if you don't believe that governments and the people should be in control of the government, not the government in control of the people, the other way around, I think then that's what makes you a globalist. Because globalism is the ideology of bureaucracy. Globalism is the ideology of anti-democracy. And that is what has been happening for all too long. And people are sick of it. And that has been what's brought populism into power. Populism is not ideal. I would be the first to admit that. But populism is what is combating the globalist bureaucracy, be it in the UK with Brexit and the EU, be it in the US with the FBI and the FISA, be it anywhere. But that people are sick of it, and that's why populism has gained traction. People believe in freedom. People believe in democracy. People believe in the idea that the nation state should be supreme and the people should be in control of the government. That's what I believe, and that's what populists believe. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so thank you, Luke. Now, as that was enacted quite well as a closing statement, so could we just have one more thing from Archie?
Sure. So, I'd just like to start, before I make my final points, by rebutting a little bit of what Luke said. Firstly, I'm going to talk about when his first point, which is that the press is anti-Trump and the press is left-wing, and that he's all for a press that doesn't take a doesn't overwhelmingly take a stand to or against something. There is plenty of press that's for Donald Trump and populism, first of all, and he named a few of them. And people pick and choose which newspapers and news channels they watch and read, and so long as they exist, I think that's okay. But the press is also it is a big step to say that the press is left wing. The press is I'm not going to deny this, overwhelmingly anti-populist. But the press is not overwhelmingly left-wing. There are so many newspapers in the UK that are anti-populist but not left-wing. There are more right-wing newspapers in this country than there are left-wing newspapers, because the newspapers have to make money and they have to appeal to what the people want, and more people are right-wing in this country than left-wing. I'd also like to talk about how Luke said that it doesn't matter that Trump is the figurehead of the Trump administration. What matters is some of the policies that he himself didn't come up with. And I don't care, and people don't care who came up with the policies. He is the figurehead, and he of that administration, and he is not, and he's just not good enough. And he is a key populist, and he is just evidence that populism isn't good enough. You can have policies that restrict China. That's another debate about whether or not there should be policies against China. But you don't need a politician that tries to destroy the present without a substantial solution for the future. And as I said in my opening statement, I'm going to repeat it again in my closing statement. Politics is about the future. Politics is about proposing a future and shaping that future. And populism does not offer a future; it breaks down the present. Luke also essentially said that the nation state is no longer sovereign. And I'd just like to say quite simply that's not true, because because as we know, and he's spoken about China and he's criticized China, and as we know, China's in the United Nations and entities like that. It still acts completely sovereign. No country is exactly bound by what other countries tell it to do. Israel it has plans now to annex Palestine, and there's been a massive opposition to that from the European Union and from lots of countries in the United Nations, and they're going to do it anyway. And that is another sovereign country. Also, just countries within the EU. Yes, the EU has laws. And yes, the EU in a way has power over its member countries, and populists argue that is why the EU is bad, because it merges together lots of different cultures, which causes divisions, and arguably, and which doesn't help anyone except for a few elite. Now, before I go on to defend the EU as an entity, I'd like to just point out that you're not bound by law, by your own law, to follow the European Union. Your own law is what matters in your country. And the European Union's laws are mainly concerned with moving forward in the world. And yes, there are mistakes in EU policy. That is not a reason for populists to insist that we need to leave the EU. Now, I'd just like to quickly defend the EU as an entity in itself. And many argue that it is going to slowly be destroyed now by cultural divisions and by divisions between populists and liberal Democrats and those on the left. But whether or not the EU has its fate within the next few years, it is a symbol of unity in the world, and it is a symbol of moving forwards, and that is important because it is, and it's an alliance between different countries, and ultimately it serves the interests of its member countries, because its members are not going to vote against things that are bad for their country, and while things like overwhelming amounts of immigration and asylum seekers have done arguably some damage to members of the EU, as I've already said, the failures of an entity and the failures of an ideology are not the reason to turn to an evil cause which does nothing other than break down the present and cause divisions. And speaking of divisions, there is a big one associated with populism, and that is that immigration apparently takes jobs. And I'm going to quite simply say that 88% of job loss in the US in 2016 was because of automation, and that statistic grows every year. And it is in no way arguable that immigration is responsible for job loss in the US. What's responsible for job loss in the US is two things, and that is the introduction of automation before countries were expecting it, and that cannot be helped, and that has to be reacted to, and that's another reason to move forwards with globalism, because developing countries are going to lose most of their population is going to lose their jobs, because most developing countries are overwhelmingly powered by industrial jobs. But it is, what needs to be done is education, not letting people in, because letting people in will just make it will make it easier for developing countries to cope, make it easier for the world economy to grow and recover. And immigration is it's good for countries, and it helps developing countries to cope. And as I just said, it's going to be good for the global economy overall. I just like to repeat that education is what matters, and that is another thing that is part of the future. And because populism offers no future, there's going to be no solution. And that is exactly why the rise of populist politics in these developing countries is very bad for them as well. My last rebuttal before I just go on to finish up is that Luke is talking about how the UK economy has flourished ever since we left the EU. We left the EU about 2 months before the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, which means that we have no idea whether or not the economy has boomed ever since. And also, even if the economy rises at a rate faster than it was rising when we were in the EU, we have no idea what it would have been like if we stayed in the EU. Therefore, that is not a fair comparison. So I'm going to wrap up now, and that is, I'm going to simply say that globalism is good for the world for reasons that I've already spoken about. Liberal democracy is good for countries because it encourages openness, it encourages the press not to lie, it encourages politicians not to get involved in the justice system, it encourages the justice system not to be corrupt, and it encourages the world to move forward. And most importantly, it encourages us to aim for a future, not just getting rid of the present, because if you only hate the present, then it's going to do nothing other than create conflict. And that's what happened, and that's what happened in the 1920s and 30s, and that can solely be blamed for the Second World War. Hatred and hatred of the present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Archie, and thank you very much everyone that's been watching this debate. Remember to check out our website if you haven't done so at analytichp.com, and we also have a lot of social media accounts such as Twitter and LinkedIn. Check those out as well. So thank you very much everyone.
This is Analytica HP.